Well, it's my pleasure tonight to introduce our speaker, who's going to speak to us on a very timely topic. Rebecca Dielschneider is Assistant Professor of Biology at Providence University College in Manitoba. She obtained a Bachelor of Science honors with co-op in microbiology and immunology at Dalhousie University. She worked at the National Microbiology Laboratory and Immunovaccine Technologies Incorporated. Rebecca graduated with a PhD in the Department of Immunology from the University of Manitoba in 2016. She serves as a local contact for the Winnipeg chapter of the CSCA and has been quite active in the CSCA and ASA in recent years, publishing in PSCF and speaking at online events. Rebecca has a strong background of teaching biological and health sciences and researching the pedagogy of immunology and the intersection of science and faith, especially when it involves vaccine hesitancy. Her topic tonight, science communication during the COVID-19 pandemic. Welcome, Rebecca. It's an honor to have you speak to us tonight, and I'm looking forward very much to your talk.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Patrick. Okay, so it's really my pleasure to be here with you all this evening. It's the evening in Manitoba, to talk a little bit about science communication and to hopefully inspire you all to communicate science as well. I put this image on my title slide here. It was designed by Balkis Aberdaman, a cancer researcher and a science communicator. And you'll probably notice right off the hop that it's inspired by Michelangelo's The Creation of David. And she pieced this together because she thought that this symbolized communication well and how both emotion with the heart and logic in the brain meet in the world of communication. So I'll talk about that a little bit today. I'm sure you've all seen some news stories and social media posts like the ones I've shown on this slide here. We know that there has been a significant problem with misinformation in this pandemic. This pandemic has highlighted and likely exacerbated the challenges that face science communication. More than ever, we need effective science communication that builds trust and informs policy. And I'll focus a little bit about trust here in my talk this morning. I did some digging and looked into some surveys that actually try to quantify trust in science. The Pew Research Center, well known for their surveys, conducted a survey back in 2019, so of course before the pandemic, and found that 45% of Americans, no, Canadians, and 38% of Americans trust science a lot. So that's a good number. At the start of the pandemic, Johns Hopkins found that 54% of their American respondents trusted science a lot. And then more recently, the 3M State of Science survey in 2021 found that 34% of their international respondents trusted science completely. And we see very similar number here is when we look at the respondents that were from Canada or from the US. In all of these surveys, they found somewhere between 10, 15, even 20% of their respondents that completely did not trust science at all, ever. And so we see a wide range in how people interact and respond and acknowledge science. So that's really one of the first things that I wanted to discuss in my talk today, really is about trust in science and why we can trust in science. And then I'll shift gears and talk much more about science communication and talk about the why, who, what, and how. And then I'll end off briefly with some ideas on how I think we can improve science communication, especially in times like these. So first and foremost, why should we trust science? Well, when we look over the world, we see over 8.8 million scientists across our globe. That's a pretty decent number. They're born all over the world, they train in different environments, and they work on different continents. So very diverse people in diverse places. Scientists are diverse genders, ages, ethnicities, and more. And they have different biases and conflicts of interest. Of course, scientists aren't without bias and without conflicts of interest. But thanks to our diversity, that can really address those biases and those conflicts of interest. Diversity can serve as a means to correct for these. Similarly, if I can notice a log in your eye, hopefully you can notice a log in mine, and we can work together well and cancel those out. So my last point here is just that consensus arising from such a large, diverse, and critical group of experts can be deemed trustworthy in the same way you would trust any large, diverse, critical group of other experts, maybe non-scientists, maybe engineers, or maybe law professionals, etc. I actually have an image here just to demonstrate some of the diversity in science. So many of these are very well-known scientists and science communicators. Maybe you recognize some of the faces on this slide. I wanted to show you their faces because not only are they fantastic people and really inspiring, but they're diverse. And maybe you'll see some people here that look like you or that you can relate to. And I think that diversity is really important. I actually put forth some effort in this presentation today to take a lot of quotes from these fabulous scholars. And so you'll hear a lot of their voices and what they've had to say in my talk here today too. So one of these scholars, Dr. Naomi Oreskes, has talked quite a bit about why we can trust science. Perhaps you've read her book published just 2 years ago in 2019. I wish I had read it in that year. Instead, I read it this year, which is perhaps a little bit too late. It would have benefited me last year and the year before that as well. So she's talked quite a bit about why we can trust science. Here is one of the quotes that I pulled from her book here. The key point is that the basis of our trust is not in scientists, some of the faces I showed on the previous slide, although they can be wise and upright, but our trust is in science as a social process that rigorously vets claims. And if any of you, like me, have tried to publish peer-reviewed papers, going through that peer review and publication process is rigorous, and there is significant vetting that takes place. She goes on to say, moreover, we may and likely will identify individuals in the community who are arrogant, closed-minded, self-important, but on the social view of epistemology, the behavior of any particular individual is not what matters. What matters is that the group as a whole includes enough diversity and maintains sufficient channels for open discussion, that new evidence and new ideas have a fair chance of a fair hearing. And that, I think, is pretty important. My last point here is just from a summary from Stephen Macedo in the introductory portion of the book. And he summarizes Dr. Oreskes' arguments very nicely by saying that we are warranted in placing an informed trust in the critically achieved consensus of the scientific community. So scientific consensus is hard won through significant critical thought and correction over time. We see scientific consensus on a variety of topics. On the topic that the Earth is round, that our climate is changing, and that these COVID-19 vaccines that we have available are safe. And we can see that consensus when we actually look at a variety of scientific societies. These societies I mentioned here are all Canadian, but likewise you can look for numerous science societies all across the world and find similar statements like you see at this website here. And so the consensus is significant, and it's easy to read and easy to understand. And so when we look at this consensus about, say, the safety of COVID-19 vaccines, what should we do with that consensus? I argue that we should talk about it and that we should communicate it, and it should be part of our everyday conversations as scientists. And so now that we've talked a little bit about trusting science, I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about why we should communicate science. This fabulous scientist turned science communicator from Puerto Rico talks quite a bit about why we should communicate science. She wrote a fantastic article in the Scientific American not that long ago, where she argues that scientific communication fosters collaboration and innovation. It helps scientists to secure funding and helps them to find jobs, helps us to write better, and importantly, it helps us be the best teachers and mentors that we can be for the next generation of scientists. So communication is really important within the scientific discipline, but science communication branches out And that has a lot of benefits as well. Science communication with the general public builds support. It promotes understanding. It encourages more informed decision-making. And importantly, lastly, it helps to make science accessible. And when science is accessible, it helps to make science even more diverse and inclusive. As I mentioned on my previous slide, the diversity of science is one of the reasons why we can trust a consensus that arises from this body of experts. This same author goes on to explain a little bit in this same article, not just why we should communicate science, but who should do that communicating, who should communicate science. Earlier on in the article, she states science communication is part of a scientist's everyday life. So if it's part of a scientist's everyday life, it sounds like scientists should communicate. If you are a scientist or in the realm of science, you should communicate. But I kind of added in this point here in one way or another. Maybe you communicate in casual conversations over coffee, or maybe you communicate in the pages of your articles or in your research papers, or maybe you communicate in conferences over a poster or after a talk, or maybe you communicate in your podcast, in the writings you submit to newspapers or in your YouTube channel. We know there's a variety of modes of communication, and of course, it's unrealistic to expect that we would make use of all of those. So in one way or another, in the way that works best with us and with our skill set, we should communicate. I argue that this is important because people are likely to listen to a friend or someone that is like them. And so if just a few people are communicating, we are leaving a significant number of people that are unreached. There are likely people that you can communicate with best that I could not, and so on and so forth. Diverse communicators reach diverse audiences. The more of us that are communicating, the more of us that are talking about our science, the more people we will reach. And perhaps, hopefully, the more people will understand the science that we do. So it's important for scientists like ourselves. So many people tuning into this talk are of science background. So hopefully you feel inspired to talk more about your work and to talk more about science in general. So as you embark on those communication efforts, what are some of the things you can say? That's an important question too. So one of my favorite science communicators, Science Sam, has given us a very simple way that we can get started. And that's actually by not really saying anything or communicating anything ourselves directly at all, but rather amplifying the messages of other communicators, of other scientists. So she says that not everyone has the time or the skill set to create new material for sharing on social media, but amplifying messages of those whose work you trust is a helpful way to contribute. We can like, we can share, we can retweet, we can go the old-fashioned route and copy and paste a URL into an email and send that off to someone. There are so many ways that we can pass on and amplify the science communication that's already taking place and help that to gain a wider audience. And so I think that this is a pretty non-threatening way to start and a non-threatening way that we can all engage in science communication through amplification. If you can't think of any helpful resources off the top of your head, I do have a few to suggest. The Unbiased Science Podcast, Science Up First, and Healthy Canadians are a few platforms that have really strong social media presence and are very easy to pass on to others and address many of our common questions and common myths as well. So you don't need to reinvent the wheel. You don't need to make these from scratch. Sometimes passing on the communication that's already out there is very helpful. You may be wondering about some Christian content. Well, of course, that's out there as well. Christians and the Vaccine, Dr. Emily Smith, the Friendly Neighbor Epidemiologist, BioLogos, and of course, you're tuning into the CSCA right now. I was going to add that on that list here, but I felt like I was tooting my own horn a little bit because I've contributed some content to the CSCA, especially this year. And so don't forget about the CSCA, but I'm confident you won't because you've tuned into this talk here today or found this talk later on YouTube. I want to focus a little bit more on Dr. Emily Smith's content. Her blog has been really inspiring to me and has helped me through some tough days in this pandemic. And I think she has some good words of wisdom about other approaches we can take in our science communication. One of the approaches that she tends to take is to actually address worries and discuss the implications of scientific findings. And this is significant because so many people that reject or struggle with science don't actually reject the scientific data, don't actually argue with that, but rather argue with what it means for their lives and the implications that they perceive. And so she addresses some of those implications, especially from her Christian scientist perspective. She's written a great article here about just after Matthew 25 in that section, where it talks about the least of these. And she says at the end of his life, Jesus made sure to remind us how to live out our faith, how to use freedom, how to humbly walk. For us during COVID, we clearly know who the least of these are, as Matthew 25 describes it, the people who are hungry, the homeless. COVID has exposed what has already divided us regarding oppressive systems, poverty, inequities, age vulnerabilities. It's exposed these and it's multiplied them. And so more than ever, do we as Christians have many of the least of these to serve. She does an excellent job of changing the rhetoric from rights to responsibilities. And I think that's been really helpful for me, helpful content to share, and hopefully helpful for you as well. She's also addressed a lot of the common arguments out there, one of them being, of course, my body, my choice. And she argues, well, as Christians, no, it's technically not. Our body is a temple of the Holy Spirit. And thus we work within kind of a different framework than perhaps non-Christians. And she goes on to discuss that more in this paragraph and in the article in her blog. And I encourage you to check it out. It's just a helpful way to reframe that perspective and to remind us how science can, the implications of some of these scientific findings for our Christian life. I'll switch gears a little bit and talk about some of the other things that we could say in our science communication. Brother Guy, no stranger to science and faith dialogue, gives some tips about affirming curiosity and information seeking. It's great to ask questions. And in doing so, we can actually do our best to promote good sources of information. And so in one of the articles that he wrote recently, he asked, why would anyone trust their lives to some random site they found on the internet? Why would we reject religion in favor of a philosophy we can read on a t-shirt or a bumper sticker? Those are pointed questions. We should recognize the temptation. It is the allure of Gnosticism, a desire to embrace secret knowledge. And if your experience has been like mine in this pandemic, you recognize this in some individuals, the temptation to find knowledge that you think others are missing out on. And that certainly some people have fallen victim to conspiracy theories and really radical ways of thinking because it is tempting and alluring and pretty powerful. And that's a hard thing to address, certainly. But I've heard some successful stories of people having calm conversations over lunch, unplugged, so no access to social media, no access to the internet and to websites, and just talking to people as they are and addressing them where they sit. Another expert that's talked quite a bit about science communication in this pandemic especially has been Timothy Caulfield, an expert in health and in law. And he's quite passionate about replacing misinformation with facts or the scientific consensus. And so he says, even if it seems absurd or frivolous, it's still important to counter because it can kind of take on a life of its own. The takeaway here is to debunk fast and debunk well. And again, I encourage you, you don't necessarily need to know how to do the debunking yourself, but you can amplify the sources that are already doing that on social media and on the internet, etc., and on YouTube and more. And so you don't need to figure out exactly how to word and how to address some of the questions and myths that are out there, but you can share the answers that are already published. It may be really easy to think that, oh, there's no way that the enzyme luciferase is in vaccines. But some people have legitimately thought that that was the case. And so if we don't actually address it, if we don't say that out loud, then perhaps some people will never know. And so it's really important to not let myths, even if they are absurd or frivolous, to persist too well, because it can lead people astray. I want to promote this debunking handbook. It was published in 2020 by a climate change organization, and they walk through some pretty significant and helpful steps when trying to debunk false information. And they emphasize that you should lead and end with the facts or the scientific consensus that is well accepted by the group of experts. Sometimes if you start with a myth and repeat it too many times, it can actually stick in an individual's memory. And so they find that emphasizing the facts at the beginning and end of any conversation you have can be enough to stick in the memory of individuals who may not have understood them to begin with. One of the last things I'll say about what we can actually talk about as we communicate science is a pretty important one, and that is to normalize complexity and the uncertainty of science. Dr. Sates, a public health professional and medical doctor, argues that it's not popular to talk about complexity, but it's still really important to mention it. Sometimes when we put in significant effort to eliminate jargon and make science accessible, we sometimes go too far and we make science out to be pristine and absolute, when of course it is neither. And so it's just better to acknowledge the complexity, especially of some of the big clinical trials that have been happening and the slight uncertainty that is present in any scientific study that's done. I think we do a disservice when we oversimplify and ignore the complexity of some of these topics. Attached to this is also how we can change our minds when we're presented with new information. Obviously, in this pandemic, that's happened several times. Public policy, public health guidelines have been updated and changed on a regular basis, which makes sense in a complex situation where new papers are being published every day and new information is coming out regularly. And so it's important to acknowledge that no one is trying to lead the general public astray, but that can certainly come across when policies change and when it appears that we're changing our mind. So just as important as what we say is how we say it. And so I think I've summarized some of the main characteristics that we as communicators and that our communication should embody. So I argue that we should be honest, humble, a bit emotional, empathetic, clear, and concise. And I think most of these characteristics are fairly self-explanatory. There's one feature on this list that maybe would surprise you right when you heard it. Maybe emotional was it? I'm not too sure. Sometimes this doesn't make it on people's lists, but the more and more that I read about effective communication and effective teaching, emotion does play a part. It's a tricky one, though, because it's one that you can easily overdo. Sometimes too much emotion can make communication or teaching or conversations of any type appear somewhat frenzied and offensive. And so a bit of emotion helps to demonstrate that we're connecting to the material and that our audience or the people we're conversing with should connect as well. But too much emotion can be detrimental. So there's a balance to strike there for sure. And then, of course, empathy is a topic I've spoken on previously in this pandemic and is a characteristic I've written about as well. Not only being able to demonstrate our emotions, but being able to connect and share in the emotions of people that we speak with is really powerful. And that's how we see what drives them, what worries them, what excites them, and we can discuss those topics with them. You may think that maybe this list is incomplete. I didn't include anything on this list about being critical. I'll talk about that in a minute. When you put some of these topics together, you can actually come up with a slightly funny acronym here So I encourage you to give them heck. It's a little bit funny because it's somewhat ironic. I don't want you to be aggressive and I don't want you to ever, be angry. But when you put all of these letters together, it comes up with somewhat of an ironic acronym there. And so as I was alluding to a minute ago, I didn't include anything about being critical on this list. And you may wonder why. I talked about the importance of critical thinking and critique in science at the beginning of my talk. So why isn't it a part of science communication? I argue, and many other communicators have argued, that critique is just misplaced in science communication, especially when that science communication involves the general public that maybe doesn't come from a critical background or from an academic background. Many science communicators agree that critique is best placed in the debates between experts and within academia or within the field of science itself, and not necessarily beyond, because extensive critique can muddy the waters and make it really difficult for the general public to perceive any type of consensus, and can actually make them think that there is no consensus. And so this is where critique is perhaps best left within conferences, within the pages of our peer-reviewed publications, and not actually in the content that we post to our Facebook page or that we write about in our blog. But this is something that a lot of people are talking about now. So it's interesting to see how science communicators are talking about critique. Naomi Oreskes did address some of this in her book about why trust science. And I'll read through this quote because I think it's just really well written. So the processes of critical interrogation rely on an assumption of good faith, that participants are interested in learning and have a shared interest in truth. It assumes that the participants do not have an intellectually compromising conflict of interest. When these assumptions are violated, when people use skepticism to undermine and discredit science rather than revise and strengthen it, and to confuse audiences rather than inform them, the entire process is disabled. It can lead scientists to want to shut down criticism rather than embrace it, which is not ideal. After all, it is challenging to maintain a spirit of openness in the face of dishonesty. The critics of science do not strengthen it as they claim. They can damage it instead. And so this is just another point to emphasize the fact that critique can easily confuse. And if it's not trying to build up or revise or strengthen science, then it may be doing the opposite. And it may be breaking science down and damaging the consensus that's been achieved. Perhaps you've been like me and you've read a lot of vaccine posts or COVID or pandemic related posts on social media that have been very critical. And it's not bad for people to ask questions and to critique, but sometimes that can mislead and confuse people who are outside of the science discipline, who may not have all of the pieces to put together themselves. I'm especially thinking of some posts that I've seen where the author will feel the need to argue that they are pro-vaccine or that they need to mention that they are vaccine confident. And sometimes I wonder why they feel the need to do that, and if some of their communication is perhaps leading the audience to think otherwise. So just encourage us all in our science communication to make sure that we're putting our best foot forward, because people outside of science may not pick up all of those pieces if we're not communicating them well. And it's great to critique. Criticism is what makes science strong and trustworthy. But when we communicate that criticism, it can be really confusing to a general audience. So one of the last comments I'll say about how we should say it is just encourage you to be Christlike. I know this is obvious to so many of us, but sometimes in the spirit of the moment, we can get a little bit heated. And so it's just important to remember the fruits of the Spirit that we know so well. I always remember a story a colleague told me about the time when they realized that they could accept evolutionary biology and much of science and still remain a faithful Christian. This colleague told me that they attended a put together evolution versus creation debate. And they noticed that it was the evolution supporter that was just manifesting these fruits of the spirit more so than their opponent. And so that's when they realized that, okay, maybe I can take this on too, and maybe it doesn't conflict with my faith as much as I once thought. And so just like talking about evolutionary biology and other topics that are just really significant in the science and faith realm, I think whenever we address those, we should do so with love and joy, peace and patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. I wanted to end my talk here this evening just by putting some points forward about how I think we can improve science communication. So the first one is to train and empower scientists to communicate. I think we need to make communication courses mandatory in our undergraduate and graduate science programs. I think we need to offer more workshops, more master's degrees in science communication that bring the humanities and the communication sciences with the sciences together. So that's why I put this point as number one. There are many excellent training opportunities available. We can certainly benefit from more and making them more accessible. Number two is that we can continue to improve science communication. And so we can improve the scientific literacy of the general population and help them to understand risk and odds and vaccines and so many complex scientific topics. This third point actually helps point number two as well, and this is to encourage and support science museums and discovery centers, because this is how we foster a love of science in our children and really in everyone. I still enjoy science museums and discovery centers. And so my points 2 and 3 are pretty related here. They help to educate and help to promote curiosity and scientific ways of thinking. My point 4 is similar to a previous point I made in this talk, and that's to amplify good science communication. We don't necessarily need to reinvent the wheel and write a lot of our own content ourselves, but we can amplify and retweet and share the excellent content that is already out there. Fifth, I suggest that we continue to build relationships. And this is something that I've tried to do more and more, is to not only make sure that my friends and the people I curl with and my colleagues and my neighbors, I obviously want to make sure that they know I'm a Christian and that they can come to me if ever they want to talk about faith topics. But it's important that they also know that I have a science background and that if they ever want to talk science, then I'm here for that as well. Because we know that people trust people that they already know. And then 6, we can continue to integrate science and faith together like the CSCA does so well. We know historically and in present day that there are many faith communities that are very hesitant about scientific topics. So if we continue to put these together in productive and friendly ways, then hopefully we can address some of that hesitancy and try to move forward and answer the questions that people are asking. And so I'll end my talk there and just summarize a few of the questions that I've asked today. I started off by trying to explain why I think we can trust science. We can trust the consensus of millions of scientists around the world because those scientists are a large body of diverse experts, and the consensus that they arrive at is really quite hard won through criticism and correction. We should communicate science for a variety of reasons, to be better scientists, but to also build support, promote understanding, and inform policy. We all should do this in one way or another through general conversations or through more elaborate communication platforms if our training allows for that. And there's a variety of angles or ways that we can actually communicate. We can calm worries, we can debunk or normalize complexity. I just discussed a few examples there. I talked about giving them heck, maybe not quite heck, but hopefully we can be honest and humble, a bit emotional, empathetic, clear, and concise. And then lastly, I talked about 6 ways that I think we can continue to do better moving forward. Obviously, none of those are quick fixes, but whenever I'm faced with a significant challenge, I pray about it and I take baby steps. And so maybe there are just a few more people that you can talk science with, Or maybe you can do a bit more amplification, or maybe there's training opportunities that you can seek out. I think there's little steps that we can all take to help improve the science messages that are sent out in communication. So I'll end my talk there. I really appreciate it for your time and attention, and I'd love to answer a couple questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. That was a stimulating talk and very helpful for all of us. And thank you for giving us heck. We needed that. That's
Anytime.
Great. So we got AJ.
Thanks, Patrick. Hi, Rebecca. I really enjoyed your talk. Thanks for talking about that today. It was really useful to see the connections between science communication and Christ, and really being like Christ to be a science communicator. I'm really interested in something else that is also on your list of achievements, and that's work in vaccine hesitancy. My question is, regarding social media, in the context of social media, I'm wondering, what is in your perspective, what is the main example of misinformation, or the cause, or the most important thing that we should take away about how to deal with misinformation in vaccine hesitancy in Canada?
Cool. Okay. So I think you were asking about the sources of information, or how best we can deal with misinformation on social media. Is that correct, AJ?
Well, yeah. I know that misinformation is often related to polarized opinions on social media. So vaccine hesitancy is related to polarized opinions. So I know that that's a feature of discourse or communication in social media that's often related to examples like vaccine hesitancy or climate denial. But I'm wondering what your perspective is, since you've studied it.
Yeah, I think I'm thinking of a few scholars now that have really examined how misinformation is spread on social media platforms. And we all know how those can just be echo chambers, where people can join a group into which they identify, and they can spread information that they all identify with. And it can become a difficult area to introduce any other rhetoric. And so I know that many social media platforms are doing their best to combat that and to remove harmful misinformation, but it seems like it's an impossible task, really. And I think that that's where, if all scientists try to have scientific conversations with the people we know, maybe we can help guide our friends and family in better directions. And maybe people who are reaching out to some of the more harmful conspiracy theories, for example, maybe they're doing that because they're looking for connection, and they feel like perhaps a political party or some other group that they identify with, perhaps they think that that is the consensus in that group. And if we try to gently show them that there are other ways of thinking and there are some other sources of information that may be good to read, maybe just those gentle relationships can help to change minds over time. And sometimes we have to perhaps consider talking to those individuals away from the internet and away from social media. I think that that can be really helpful too. A calmful conversation over coffee that's unplugged, with no Google, with no Facebook, can, I think, do wonders.
Just wondering, you mentioned in context of what you just said, you said that there are some scholars that you've read that deal with the issue. I'm wondering, could you let us know those scholars' names, just, or make a referral to any kind of material that would be good to read up on?
Yeah, the first person whose name comes to mind is Timothy Caulfield. I mentioned him in my lecture there. And so the Science Up First content is some of his handiwork. And so he is just well-versed in media, especially in celebrities and some of those charismatic leaders that can unfortunately lead people astray. His name comes to mind first, but I can certainly think of some more and pass those along.
That would be great. I would really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Anytime. Thanks, AJ. I think Valerio, perhaps you had your hand up next.
I sure did. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Hi, Valerio.
Okay. Thank you for the talk. That was very interesting. A couple of things. I mean, there's the question of trust in individual scientists, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then there's the question of trust in scientific organizations. And the two are not the same. And I think that a lot of people distrust science because they actually distrust the organizations. We all know these organizations are subject to political influence, ideologies, all that kind of stuff. So what would you say to somebody, for example, who said, you know what, I really don't trust what the NIH says because, they helped create this thing. They helped create the pandemic. They funded research, which was questionable. So why would I trust them, right? Or why would I trust them if anybody who's got a dissenting opinion is censored? Like you did mention removing harmful misinformation, but you know what? That's censorship. And if anything, that's going to decrease trust.
Maybe
those types of things there, those are some of the hard questions, right? So
yeah, definitely.
Kind of see what your thoughts are on that.
So about the scientific organizations, I definitely hear what you're saying. A scientific organization can be a very like-minded group of individuals, and maybe there are biases there. Likely there are biases there. I think when we look at this COVID-19 pandemic and the vaccine specifically, let's look at those examples. It's not just organizations within the US that are promoting these products, these public health measures. It's organizations in Canada, it's organizations in the UK and across Europe, it's organizations across the world and the World Health Organization overall. And so I wouldn't ever suggest that you just listen to one isolated organization because you're right. Maybe there are conflicts of interest. But when all organizations across the globe, when all countries are moving in a similar manner with these vaccines and with public health measures, then I think we can place our confidence in those because that's an international consensus that's significant. And just your comment about censorship is one that I hear often. And the few scientists that have spoken up opposing vaccines, whether they're from Canada or the US or from elsewhere, they should have channels within the scientific community to publish those ideas and those theories. And many of them have done so, and many of them have been met with significant criticism within science. Science as a discipline, as I mentioned earlier in my talk, should be receptive to other ideas. And when it isn't, I think that is a cause for concern. But for the few individuals that I can think of off the top of my head, they have put their ideas out there, and peer reviewers and the scientific community have met them with significant skepticism or critique, which is what should happen in science. And so if that isn't happening, then that for sure is a problem. I'll make a bold quote right here in one of the pages of Naomi Oreskes' book. She does talk about the skeptics of science further. And of course she did in her previous work, Merchants of Doubt, even further. She does make the bold statement that some skeptics are just sore losers. Some of them are legitimate and some of them just want a platform. And so it's really where we have to talk to scientific communities at large, across the world, across diverse groups to hopefully cancel out any bias or any conflict of interest, to actually weigh in on those ideas and on those theories to see if they are based on any significant data.
Okay, thank you for that.
Thanks, Valeria. I don't know, Mark, if you have a question or if James.
I did have a question. Thank you for that. I'm not a scientist, so I know some of this doesn't apply to me as directly, but I have a science teaching undergrad. But I'm wondering, I was really intrigued by your 4-step process that you showed on the screen. And I think I should probably try to take that to heart. But I was a little confused how you said to warn against the myth and to kind of explain where it goes wrong. But then a little later you said that we shouldn't be critical. And I'm guessing that you meant critical in a sense that I'm missing when you say that. Because to me, dismantling a myth or warning about it is a part of being critical. So.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's a good thing that I can clarify. Thanks, Mark. So the critique that I was talking about in science communication that we should try to avoid is perhaps like the hot take or our opinion on a really small detail that can be misinterpreted by the broad community as a critique against a broad consensus overall. And so, like, say, what's a good example? Some have critiqued, say, vaccine distribution and said that maybe before we give Canadians a third dose, maybe we should give away more of those doses to other countries and communities around the world that don't have access. And I think sometimes when those critiques make it into the popular media, into social media, some people in the general public can take, oh, that expert is critiquing vaccine distribution. They have questions and qualms about these vaccines, so there is not consensus about the vaccine. And so that's some of the critique that I think can be tricky to navigate in science communication. And I'm seeing more and more people talk about that because I think it's just a lesson that we're starting to learn in this pandemic, that critique is really difficult to communicate. When it comes to myths, like I'm talking when that critique is somehow related to a consensus, like a small little detail that can be misinterpreted as a critique against the entire consensus. But when you're actually debunking a myth, like say the microchips in vaccines, you actually do need to critique that misinformation. And so critiquing misinformation and critiquing something within a scientific field, I think, are very different. And I should have made that distinguish better. So thanks for asking that question. I think, James, maybe you are next if we have time for a few more questions.
Yeah, can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Good, okay. One of the things that worries me is that before the pandemic, really, on one side, people thought about science was wonderful, a documentary and everything is wonderful and everything's sewn up by the end of the hour. And the other side is, every week we have another paper about whether coffee is good for you or bad, and so on. And so we've got that sort of mess going on. And then we have a pandemic when people are actually seeing science in real time because we don't know the answers. And many of the things we say may be wrong. And I don't know how to pass that to try and get people to understand that science is messy. And we're having to do this in real time, and yet it's important. And how are we going to pass that? Because then there's a lot of other people with crazy ideas. Maybe we're crazy. We don't know yet. We're trying to work it out. Any thoughts?
Yeah, no, so many science communicators have talked exactly about what you just spoke about, the doing the science in the middle and everyone at the edge of their seat, waiting to see what scientists and the scientific community are going to talk about next in this pandemic. It certainly has shed a light on a process that usually hasn't been dissected so closely. I was going to make another point about, you mentioned caffeine, which is a great example of, I think, a topic that is still up for debate in the scientific community. I don't think there is a consensus on how much coffee or what type of coffee or when we should drink coffee that's best for our health. So there's so much about nutrition and many other topics that are still very active areas of research. And I think that's where we can acknowledge the complexity and acknowledge that these are active areas of research and perhaps a consensus hasn't been achieved yet. But I think clearly in some other topics, we have achieved consensus. And I think acknowledging the uncertainty and acknowledging the fact that we're all open to change our minds if and when we're presented with new forms of information, I think is helpful. And I think that can promote trust too. But it's a tricky one. You've hit on a lot of big issues there.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. So let's go to Robert Mann. You can ask your final question.
Yeah, okay. Thanks, Rebecca. Very interesting, very nice presentation. But James raised one of the issues I was going to raise. I think the biggest challenge or the biggest problem is that at the end of the day, we're asking people to trust experts. And I think the biggest problem with that is that many people feel there's a very good reason not to trust experts over the lifetime of baby boomers. One can think of the financial collapse of 2008. One can think of diet trends that seem to go back and forth all the time. And to tell people, oh, well, that's not finished, doesn't inspire them with much confidence. And honestly, I do it about when I got vaccinated. What did I do? I went to a clinic. I trusted that what they were putting in me was the right thing. I trusted that it was going to do it, but I had no direct evidence or proof. Mm-hmm. And we are asking people to do that. And so we're up against the fact that A, experts have repeatedly disappointed. B, Western education tells people, be critical, don't trust the experts. So am I exaggerating those things?
No, I don't think you're exaggerating. And I hope that we would never lose the push for critical thinking in our education. We should always be asking questions. But hopefully when all of our questions are answered and when we're satisfied that indeed it's not just a small body of experts, but a massive one of millions that have arrived at a consensus that perhaps that's something we can trust, just like we trust any body of evidence from other experts. And so it's a tricky one because, of course, scientists aren't perfect. No people are. And you've said we've had economic collapses and there have been a lot of mistakes in the past. Some people have argued that some of those mistakes have happened because science was at a point where it wasn't as diverse as it is now. So hopefully, as we become more and more diverse, we bring in more perspectives, more different viewpoints, we cancel out those biases and those conflicts of interest, and we can move science forward in a better way. But you're right. People can just be mistrusting, especially people that have been harmed in the past. And so I think that's where we can all come into play and say that, not every scientist is a bad person. And if everyone befriends a scientist or reaches out to scientists more often, or if we make ourselves more approachable, then we can try to rewrite that mad scientist type of media stereotype that's out there. And try to build trust in ways that relationships do really well. But there will always be mistrust. I don't think we'll ever get rid of that, but we can do our best to address it and to build that trust up to a point where we have some more confidence. Not an easy question to answer though, Robert. Thanks.
Well, once again, Rebecca, thank you so much for giving your talk and for being willing to engage us in some discussion. So I know if this were a live meeting, we'd all be clapping. And so thank you so much. Appreciate your efforts.
Thank you, Patrick. And I'm appreciative of the CSE executive that invited me here today. Thank you.
Quite welcome.